Today we're going to be talking all about why your novel sucks and what you need to do to fix it. Coming up next. Hi everybody, my name is Dee Burks and this is Retirement Rescue, where we talk about how to make money, save money, and live well in retirement. Well, my main occupation is writing books. I'm a professional ghostwriter for nonfiction, but I also write fiction for myself, and I've taught novel writing for the last 14 plus years. And if there's one thing I have heard repeatedly from writers is, I got partway through this book and it just fell apart. It's not going anywhere. It just doesn't feel right. I've lost interest in my own book. How does that happen? Well, there are a number of reasons it happens, but the biggest one is you don't have enough conflict. Conflict is one of those things that people really underestimate. But if you're going to write a book that is anywhere from 50 to 100,000 words, you're going to have enough different types of conflict to carry that entire book. And the problem is most people start with a little bit of conflict, and then about page 100 or 20,000 words, the book runs out of steam. And that's because your conflict ran out of steam. So we're going to talk about what conflict is and how you put enough of it into your story to carry the entire book. Now, conflict exists on 3 different levels. And if you're going to write a really good, well-rounded story, you need all 3 levels of conflict for your characters to have enough to work with. Now, the first level of conflict is the character versus himself. He's got some sort of internal conflict. Maybe your character has daddy issues or mommy issues or abandonment issues, or they have all sorts of issues they themselves have. Either trauma from the past or fear of the future. They have struggles within their own mind and their own heart. That is one level of conflict. And when you talk about that first level of conflict, you also have to understand the motivation for your characters. It's almost like, when you hear stereotypical actors talking about, hey, what's my motivation? Yes, you need to know the motivation of your characters. And for people, there are basically only 4, count them 4, big motivators. It is love, lust, fear, and greed. Those are the 4 big human motivators. And almost every conflict your character has is going to come down to one of those issues. Let's take, for example, let's say your character is a 30-year-old guy. And he is resistant in joining the family business and he wants to do his own thing. What that comes down to is the character has a problem with his dad and is so afraid of becoming his dad, he avoids it completely. That's the issue. That's the internal conflict of that character. So for each one of your characters, you're going to have to know what their internal conflict and internal struggles are. That's the first level. Now, the second level of conflict is your character versus other characters. People are really difficult, and you want them to be difficult. You're going to have people within your story that your character gets along with, and people within your story that your character does not get along with. You have got to have that conflict between human beings. That is going to help your character face their own internal issues. Both those levels of conflict have to exist in any story. Minimum, those 2 levels. But you're not going to have a really, really big story unless you have the 3rd level. Now, the 3rd level is your character against the universe. There are external things that happen that human beings cannot control. The first 2 levels of conflict, there is some type of control that your character has over it. They have control over themselves. They have control to a certain extent over how they relate to every other person. But there are some things that happen in the larger world they cannot control. That is what makes this level of conflict so interesting. When you have an event like a hurricane, or the character gets shot, or someone they love gets kidnapped, that is beyond their control. That is beyond their normal way of being. That's what takes a story from just namby-pamby little story to a big story. And let me give you an example. If you take a love story about a girl who's wealthy and a boy who's poor, and you do the girl ends up leaving her wealth in order to have her freedom, that's a regular story. But if you put it in the setting of the sinking of the Titanic, it becomes a big story. Because the sinking of the Titanic was well beyond what those characters would normally have ever dealt with. It changed the whole story in a myriad of ways. So when you look at the levels of conflict in your story, you have to look at internal conflict, and if you haven't given your character some sort of internal conflict, then the story is just going to lay there. And this is true even if you've got an action-adventure story. What would the Joker be without his backstory? What would Indiana Jones be without his daddy issues? I mean, every character has that deeper layer. And when you tap into that deeper layer, you get the big story. So go back, if you haven't already, go back when you're doing your character study and you think about what are the issues this character has. So even when you think, oh, well, this is just about regular people, there's no such thing as regular people. There's really no such thing. So if you're writing a character that is your idea of normal, but they have nothing interesting about them, you're writing a very flat character. And at every level of your story, you want to ask yourself, if you get to a point you think, gosh, I don't know where to go, always ask yourself, what's the worst thing that could happen at this point? What could possibly be the worst thing that could happen? I have a friend who, when she talks about this, she talks about take your character, put him up in a tree, and throw rocks at him. Absolutely make things as hard as possible. Give them an impossible situation. Make them face whatever fear they have. Put them in a situation that makes sense, but forces them to make some decisions. That's what moves your story forward. The reason your story runs out of steam is you're to a point where they don't have to make any decisions. Life is too easy for them. There's nothing upcoming. There's nothing they have to face. There's not a ticking clock. When we talk about conflict, one of the things that it's really important to remember as a writer is it's super helpful to put in a ticking clock. For example, on the Titanic, you see the word Titanic come up on the movie screen, you know the ship's going down. There's no other alternative. It gives it that level of tension. You know, if you set your story within a war, that war has a beginning point and an end point. There's another level of tension. You know, if your character is chasing down a serial killer, there's a ticking clock. Boy, if they don't find him, they'll kill somebody else. They've got to do it now. It's got to happen now. Giving some sort of ticking clock in the background of your story for what happens and how things are going to eventually unfold adds to that level of tension. That's part of that character versus the universe, is that ticking clock. You know, you've got to put some sort of time limit, some sort of goal, some sort of thing that has to happen. And that will help you with that tension. It is very common for writers, even New York Times best-selling writers, to get partway through their book and realize, I don't have enough conflict. Because the story starts to slide. It starts to feel very yawn. The tension gets dropped. You don't have anything pressing. And it's frustrating because you realize you have to go back and rewrite it. But that's part of being a writer. You have to increase that conflict, and it's got to be good conflict. It can't be things that don't make sense. And this is one of the reasons that I have such a problem with things like billionaire books. It's like it is so easy for that character to throw money at something and fix it. And really, is that a good story? To me, no, it's not. If that's the whole theme of the story, he's going to fix it by throwing money at it, or she. That is not a good story to me. There's not enough conflict. It would be a much better story if you take that billionaire and then they don't have any money and they've got to figure out how to live life and accomplish what they're going to do without that crutch they have always had. That's a much better story to me because there's so much more conflict. There's so much more conflict. So when you look at creating your world and creating your characters, think of a world that is not easy. Even if you have wealthy characters, characters with social status, characters that have all these things and they should have an easy life, there are a lot of things you can do to complicate that life, and you should. You absolutely should. One of the ways you know you have enough conflict in a book is if you sit down to write it and it's hard. Good stories are hard. They force you as a writer to think things through, to really figure out all the steps, to figure out all the conflict points, to figure out the resolutions you're going to have. They're hard. If it's hard for you, it's going to be hard for your characters, and it should be hard for your characters. You know, if it's easy for you as a writer just to whip it out and it's just a story, that's what your readers are going to think. It's just a story. I mean, how many times have you read a book that was kind of interesting? You read the whole book at least, but 6 weeks later, you can't remember the name of the book. You have no clue who the author was. You kind of know what happened, but you don't really remember any of the characters. That's not a great story. That's not a big book. And that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about writing your average story. If you want to be average, you go for it. But most writers do not want to be average. They want to write the big book. They want to write that book that just is great, and they know it's great. So if you want to be that kind of writer, you take these ideas about conflict and you put as much conflict as your book will hold, and it will be the next great American novel. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, please click subscribe, and I'll see you next time.